Uncover the shocking truth behind Hitler's fashionable secret. You won't believe which organization wore Hugo Boss costumes. Prepare to be amazed as we delve into the twisted world of Nazi propaganda, violence, and the unexpected twists of history. From the Olympic Games deception to the rise and fall of the Third Reich, get ready for a thrilling journey into the dark heart of Adolf Hitler and his nefarious regime. The first organization to be costumed by Hugo Boss was the Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler. It's difficult to imagine any other historical leader going to a catwalk showing of new clothes for soldiers. Hitler, unique to the Third Reich, utilized well-planned propaganda and brutal acts of violence simultaneously. However, the 1936 Olympic Games would temporarily halt the terror and suppression of anti-Semitism. Hitler understood the power of the Games and exploited them to project a false image of a peaceful, tolerant Germany to Europe and the world. Captain Eric Brown, a spectator at the Games, noted the impact of Nazi propaganda. Despite the carefully crafted message, a black American athlete, Jesse Owens, stole the show with his remarkable achievements. After the Olympics, the Nazis renewed their persecution of the Jewish population. The infamous Kristallnacht in 1938 marked a violent escalation of anti-Semitic actions. The propaganda of a Jewish world conspiracy continued, despite its lack of widespread belief among the German population. The Nazis addressed the unemployment problem by offering jobs to the unemployed, but the conditions were often coercive, with pressure to join the Nazi Party. Anti-Semitism persisted, fueled by the Department of Propaganda, portraying Jews as part of a conspiracy. Hitler's popularity rose as he delivered on promises and achieved non-violent territorial gains in the late 1930s. The reoccupation of the Rhineland, Anschluss of Austria, and the Czechoslovak crisis were seen as successes, bolstering his image. Kristallnacht in 1938 marked a turning point as Ernst von Rath's assassination triggered widespread violence against Jews. Hitler's facade of a tolerant Germany during the Olympics crumbled, revealing the true nature of Nazi persecution. Germany's rapid rearmament and territorial gains went largely unchecked by other nations. The Munich Agreement in 1938 and the invasion of Poland in 1939 set the stage for World War II. Hitler's calculated gambles aimed at achieving his vision of a dominant Germany. The invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the beginning of World War II. Hitler's victories in Western Europe, including the fall of France, bolstered his popularity within Germany. The Blitzkrieg strategy and the Battle of Britain further solidified his image as a successful leader. Rudolf Hess's mysterious flight to Scotland in 1941 added intrigue to the Nazi regime. However, Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in the same year proved to be a miscalculation. The invasion aimed at bringing Britain to terms and eliminating the perceived threat of Bolshevism. As Hitler pursued his vision of conquest, his self-confidence and arrogance led to strategic errors. The invasion of the Soviet Union marked a turning point, signaling the decline of Nazi support and the beginning of a costly and bloody war that would ultimately end the regime. Flushed with success from the Blitzkrieg in Western Europe, they thought all they had to do was attack. In a way, it was a bit silly actually, because that had been the mentality of 1914. With a bit of luck, if he had gone earlier, he may have succeeded in temporarily conquering Russia. Today, American news agencies report Russia is strongly counterattacking and that less than 1/50th of Russia's vast area has been invaded. These pictures show them the beginning of the Blitz that turned into a siege. There was some encouragement in that Stalin had done a great deal of damage to his armed forces through the purges of the mid-later 1930s, but how it would ever police it for the rest of this time, I don't think he'd even begun to think it through. Tens are troops in action from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Great clashes between Russian and German tank squadrons have been reported. In the autumn of 1941, the Germans were on course, just cutting through butter, going to take Moscow, going to take Leningrad, and they didn't, and they were stopped. Operation Barbarossa would be a definitive turning point in the fortunes of the Nazi regime. The March on Moscow was the end of what had started as a successful campaign. Hitler had gained many territories in Eastern Europe, but it was the harsh Soviet winter and the tough belligerence of the Red Army that would finally see the Nazis defeated and home support of the regime finally turn. Here, apparently, the Germans got their first sight of the Russian scorched earth tactics that American reporters say should be even more effective now that winter has set in and Hitler's photogenic army must face General Snow and General Mud. Once you get into 1942, they're now fighting on quite a number of fronts. Army leave is being canceled, so people aren't getting home. Food rationing is getting more stringent, and people are becoming depressed and disillusioned. It was not just the German population who were becoming despondent. Many officers in the German army were also starting to question their Führer's actions. Throughout the war, there were attempts to assassinate Hitler, many of them orchestrated by anti-Hitler generals and soldiers. But they could none of them manage it. All the former Social Democrats and Communists, about a third of the electorate in the last free election in 1932, had effectively been brought in line. Their resistance movements mostly distributing leaflets and kind of keep the flame going, as it were. They'd all been suppressed by the Gestapo. It was very difficult to resist in the Third Reich because denunciation was widespread. If somebody ever heard you or got a clue that you know you're doing Zeiss, then they would go down to Gestapo headquarters and turn you in. So the only people who could really resist as a group were the senior army officers with a few conservative politicians attached. And they are the ones who then prepared the assassination of Hitler as things were beginning to go really seriously wrong in 1943. Klaus von Stauffenberg was a general in the German army who had been injured serving in North Africa, losing his right hand, 2 fingers on the left, and also his left eye. Von Stauffenberg was the most unlikely assassin. He'd been seriously injured, he could prime the bomb only with great difficulty, and so on. But nobody else could be found to do it, and he was determined now that his German patriotism could only be expressed by destroying Hitler. Hitler would destroy Germany, and if you were a patriot, your job is to destroy. Although the bomb von Stauffenberg detonated killed 4 people, Hitler was shielded by a solid oak table and was only left with minor injuries. Von Stauffenberg was found guilty of high treason and subsequently executed. Having survived the assassination attempt, Adolf Hitler was still convinced that the war was for winning, even though the German nation suspected the worst. He's always hoping when he looks back at history that something will happen politically, the alliance will fall apart, or Germany will invent an amazing new weapon. But somehow or other, you can pluck victory from the jaws of defeat, just as his great hero Frederick the Great had done. I'm not sure there's ever a point actually in which Hitler says, "I recognize it, I failed, we're going to be defeated." The battle on the Eastern Front turned into a long war of attrition. The German army was ill-prepared for this, and the Russian army with far greater resources would, in 1944, finally defeat the attacking German army. The paradox of the attack eastwards was that the more territory Hitler gained, the greater was the Jewish population he acquired. The war changed everything, and Germany's victories across Europe, and then in the East after June 1941, from having a population of 600,000 Jews in 1933, the number of Jewish people under the Reich's inverted commas administrative military control soared to many millions of people. Hitler's problem, a self-inflicted problem, is he attacks Poland, and the largest concentration of European Jews falls into his hands. And as he moves elsewhere in Eastern Europe, more Jews come under his rule. The original idea had been to expel German Jews from Germany, and Jews were expelled into Poland, for example. But that doesn't solve the problem. Once you've invaded Poland, the Madagascar Plan was an idea to establish a Jewish colony on the African island of Madagascar. It was subsequently shelved in 1942. I don't think anybody ever asked Madagascar to settle a Jewish colony there to ship out European Jews, but that I think was never really going to come to anything. There had been talk about enforced deportations of a captive Jewish population out of Germany, out of Europe. How are they going to do that? That, by its very nature, would have been a brutal, murderous exercise. The Wannsee Conference was a meeting of Nazi officials in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, to establish a final solution to the Jewish problem. They formalized the operation of the Holocaust while it was already underway, while it had already started. People like Eichmann, Heydrich showed up to take the decisions in a chillingly managerial way. No need for Hitler to be present. They didn't need him. They knew Hitler would sanction what they were going to do. The extermination camps would eventually operate around the clock. In the last acts of this brutal conflict, Adolf Hitler would unleash one final command that would order the futile resistance of his party faithful. War on the Eastern Front was a battle too far. It signaled the end for the Nazi regime. The German nation was heavily rationed, and those dwelling in the urban centers were facing ever-increasing bombing raids by the Allied forces. Hitler, however, remained defiant. Later on, Hitler lived in a fantasy world of his own. Even in the last days of the war, he was conjuring up in his own mind imaginary armies, secret weapons, extraordinary make-believe scenarios. He maintained his faith because it was a matter of will. The 1934 party rally was called Triumph of the Will, and Hitler and Goebbels, to a very great extent, and some other close followers maintained this belief that their will would prevail. Nobody had the nerve to try to disabuse Hitler of his fantasies, even in the last days. In the autumn of 1944, a group of generals came to Hitler's headquarters. The generals go in and say to Hitler, "We are convinced that the war is lost." They're in there for about, an hour and a half or something. And they come out again, their eyes shining, saying the Führer has convinced us that we could win the war. By then, he'd already decided that the German people had betrayed him. They had proved unworthy of their great destiny and deserved the fate that was descending upon them, an extraordinary mental and moral universe to inhabit. June 6, 1944 saw the D-Day landings and would be the start of the Allied invasion of occupied Western Europe. Germany found they were retreating from all fronts as the Red Army marched from the east. Close to defeat, Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree. On March 19, 1945, an order was sent out that all German infrastructures must be destroyed to prevent the Allies utilizing them as they advanced. It also called for every last house and street to be fought for. It happened in small villages which had nothing to do with the war. They had to stand and fight when American tanks came, that kind of thing. It just was absolutely criminal. So he blamed reverses and defeats on the lack of willpower in his generals, not on the lack of material or the superiority of the enemy. It had terrible repercussions for Germans because it meant that the whole of Germany had to be invaded, fought over, occupied by foreign troops in a way that had not happened in the First World War. Because Hitler wouldn't surrender in the closing stages of the war, a large number of the Nazi faithful realized that the war was effectively lost. This resulted in mass suicides throughout Germany. There's this feeling of Gotterdammerung, the twilight of the gods. We all die together because life after the Reich isn't worth living. Now, that's an extraordinary sensation, and I think one can't fully explain it. You have to understand the extraordinarily rigid hold the regime had on people. The great many of the party faithful committed suicide because they simply couldn't face the idea of German defeat. They've been fed propaganda for years. The defeat would mean the partition of Germany. It might mean the deliberate impoverishment. There were rumors that all German males would be castrated, and all kinds of extraordinary things went around in 1945. Historians have tried to quantify the numbers, but in the ghastly chaos of the Third Reich in its final days, mass murder, nihilistic orgies of killing by the Nazi state, and its death throes, it's hard to know what the actual figures really were. Knowing that the Soviets were advancing swiftly towards his bunker, Hitler gave his last will and testament, making Joseph Goebbels as Reich Chancellor and naming no one as his successor as Führer. The next day, April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself. Two of Hitler's immediate circle, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, remained loyal to him right to the end. They stayed in the bunker in Berlin. For Goebbels, there was nowhere else to go. He felt that if the Third Reich collapsed, if it was killed, that was it, everything was over. An extraordinary sense of apocalypse seemed to overtake them, and they felt that was the only course of action open to them. On May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda committed suicide, but before doing so, killed their 6 children by drugging them and then poisoning them with cyanide. Both Himmler and Göring would commit suicide as well, but this was not before they were interrogated by the Allies. Captain Erich Braun, posted to Germany to look for jet wind tunnels, was tasked with the job of identifying Himmler and was able to interrogate Göring. Himmler was arrested near the Danish border with false papers. The Waffen-SS officer phoned headquarters at Lüneburg and said, "We've picked up somebody who we think might be him. Could you come up and identify him? You said when you saw him in civil life that he used to walk with a slightly peculiar gait. And could you come up and try to identify this guy?" So I went up, and the moment I walked in, I knew it was him. Meaning, without making him walk, absolute coward. I think he was frightened after his life, always trying to evade anything that directly threatened him. Accompanied by these two SS men, Heinrich Himmler, the most hated man in Europe, was captured by British troops outside this town. Concealed in Himmler's mouth was a tiny vial of deadly poison. While being examined, he swallowed it. Goering was in American custody, and Erich was able to ask him key questions about Nazi aircraft strategy. He was charismatic, very intelligent. He came out of World War I with great honor, had a huge reputation in Germany, a good man who went very wrong. He was corrupted by the system he joined, and he lost all his qualities of honor and began to lust for power and luxury. And that, of course, was his total downfall. At Lüneburg, Germany, before a British military court, the greatest mass murder trial in history, these Nazis were guards at notorious Belsen concentration camp, where 4 million prisoners died. The end of the war signaled the beginning of peace for many across Europe and the rest of the world. There was a tangible sense of relief in the air, but as occupied land was liberated, the full horror of the Nazi regime was revealed. Erich Braun was part of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Piles of dead bodies, piles of walking dead, really just a horror story. Now Belsen, the human slaughterhouse where numberless victims were once burned to death, is itself put to the torch. Nearby, Nazi women guards are lined up for questioning. He wanted me to interrogate the camp, called my dad, who was called Joseph Karma, and the lady coming down here, McGregor. Kramer's chief's assistant was Irma Gries, in curls whose name struck terror into the hearts of Belsen's inmates. She's the worst human being I've ever met. Cruelty was a trade. There was nothing too cruel for this woman to do. When it came to interrogating her, I asked her if she had her time over again. Would she do all this? She refused to answer. After about 4 or 5 times like this, she suddenly left her feet and gave the Nazi salute, shouted Heil, and sat down and refused to talk. But we executed the lot. You can hardly defend yourself when outside the window there's a pile of bodies as high as this ceiling in a pit. Newsreel films of the atrocities at Belsen shocked the world. Even death for Kramer and his gang cannot avenge the crimes of the Beast of Belsen. What started as Hitler's strong anti-Semitic beliefs in the wake of World War, I ended as what we now know as the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with tens of thousands of gypsies, homosexuals, communists, mentally ill, and the physically disabled. In the aftermath of the war, the Allied forces would soon stake their own territorial claims, which would leave the conquered nation divided. Germany in 1945 was an extraordinary mess. 60% of its urban area had been obliterated from the air. Germany was occupied by the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, the French, British, Americans, very heavy military occupation. It was economically impoverished, and it was difficult to see, in fact, in 1945, where Germany was going to go, how Germans were going to survive. Widespread hunger, even starvation in places. There were all kinds of measures to stop any recrudescence of Nazism. Nazi laws were revoked. There's a re-education effort of trying to educate Germans in the evils of Nazism. But in a sense, that's all less important than the fact that Nazism had brought, in the end, nothing but death and destruction. After the war, the nation of Germany would be split in two. To the east, the Soviet-occupied area became the German Democratic Republic. The area to the west, which Britain, France, and the US occupied, became the Federal Republic of Germany. This division was most notably illustrated in Berlin. The Berlin Wall was erected in 1961 and would be a chilling visual reminder of a nation divided. I was sent back to Germany in the mid-1950s. I found it difficult to reform the relationship with some of them whom I knew what they had done in the war, but in general I realized that some of them had been led like sheep to the slaughter. I think post-war Germany is a great epic in the act of remembrance and admission. For a nation to confront its guilt like that is extraordinary because a lot of other nations have a lot of other skeletons in the cupboard. Hitler remains a source of intrigue for many people throughout the world. Hitler exerts a kind of fascination that you could never really imagine. We spend so much time writing books about programs about Hitler and so on. I think Hitler would have been amazed by the extent of historical attention that's paid to him. You'll always get young bloods who will be attracted to the style of their Nazi relation. They've actually given us the image not of themselves, but of their ideal. It is an extraordinary story how this nondescript man, stateless radical politician with a whole lot of wacky ideas in the 1920s could suddenly become Germany's dictator, then unleash the largest war and embark on the biggest crime the world has ever known. I think that the public, 70 years old, is still fascinated by those paradoxes. Today, Germany is a nation united. The economic miracle that West Germany experienced in the 1950s, supported by the Marshall Plan, gave them the basis to develop a strong economy and political stability. The real miracle, however, should be credited to the people of Germany. By confronting their brutal history, they have allowed the world to learn from the mistakes made in their past. Although persecution, hatred, and war are still global problems, Germany has sanctioned its history to be used as the marker of cruelty, which should never again be repeated. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified when our next video is uploaded next week. This is the third and final video in our series on Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Stay tuned for more captivating content in the future.